black and still dares to enter the courthouse like she owns the floor beneath her feet. No badge shown, no name announced, just quiet steps and a sealed envelope held like a verdict. The halls ignore her. The walls know better. She passes uniforms that look through her, not at her. But behind that calm, behind those gray eyes, is a woman who didn't come to plead. She came to expose. By nightfall, the officer who humiliated her will stand in chains before the very seat he thought she'd never touch. Because sometimes justice doesn't knock. It returns uninvited. And when it doesn't raise its voice. It watches, records, and it never forgets. So tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? The morning air hung heavy with humidity, even though the sun had barely crested the tree line beyond the courthouse parking lot. Naomi Graves stepped out of the unmarked black sedan without a word, her low-heeled shoes striking the pavement with a rhythm both practiced and quiet, like someone who had spent decades walking into rooms where her presence was noted, but never truly welcome. She wore a navy blue skirt suit, pressed with careful attention, a crisp white blouse underneath, and a slim leather case clutched tightly in her right hand. Her fingers wrapped around it as if it contained not just documents, but something far more personal, perhaps the only proof of who she still was, in a world determined to forget. The building ahead of her didn't look like much a three-story rectangle of concrete and tinted glass, the kind of architecture that tried to erase its own history. Above the entrance, a faded flag flapped lazily against a sky, half muted by overcast light, and behind its glass doors, fluorescent fixtures buzzed softly like tired insects. Naomi paused for a moment before stepping forward, breathing in with a quiet steadiness that had taken her years to master, the kind of breath you learn to take when you know the room you're about to enter might not recognize your authority, even if the badge in your case says otherwise. Inside, the temperature dropped. The lobby was sterile, and still smelling faintly of disinfectant and printer ink, and manned by a lone officer behind the security desk, scrolling absently through a phone. As Naomi approached, his posture stiffened, not with respect but suspicion, the kind that rises when someone walks in without announcing themselves the way others usually do. He didn't greet her. He didn't ask if she had an appointment. He just stared. "I'm here under federal order," Naomi said, calmly offering the sealed envelope instead of an ID. Her voice was smooth but firm, without the tremble of apology or the arrogance of entitlement. She watched as the officer glanced at the envelope, then narrowed his eyes like he was being tested on a rule he hadn't studied for. "That's not standard procedure," he muttered, rising from his seat. He was in his early 40s, white thickset, with a buzz cut and a jaw clenched a little too tight. His badge read Burke, and his posture said everything else. "You can't just walk in here without clearance and expect us to roll out a carpet." Naomi didn't flinch. "You'll find the clearance inside," she replied, her tone unchanging. "It's marked Priority Level 3. But Burke didn't open the envelope. Instead, he motioned for her to follow him down a side hallway without asking any more questions. There was something in the way he moved, brisk but not rushed, his hand hovering close to his belt holster, like an instinct, not a threat, as if her presence alone had already triggered something inside him that words couldn't explain. Naomi followed, silent, aware that any resistance would be interpreted as a challenge, and that in places like this, challenges often ended with someone being silenced. The hallway smelled of old paint and stale air. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to make the space feel abandoned. Burke didn't look back at her once. "We'll verify your claims in the processing room," he said flatly, like he was reciting a line he'd used 100 times before. Naomi knew this wasn't protocol. There was no standard where a federal officer was led away without identification being reviewed or contact made with a supervisor. But she also knew that in buildings like this, some people didn't follow standards. They followed instinct, and instinct, especially in men like Burke, rarely worked in her favor. She could hear the echo of their footsteps bouncing off the linoleum, hers, measured and silent, his louder punctuated with a kind of certainty that came from years of not being questioned. A part of her wanted to speak up, to remind him that her authority outweighed his, that, within the hour, he might be answering to her. But another part, the part shaped by decades of walking the tightrope between power and survival, told her to wait, not out of fear, out of precision. When they reached the end of the corridor, Burke opened a plain steel door with a swipe of his keycard. The room inside was cold and windowless, furnished with 2 metal chairs bolted to the floor and a table with rounded corners. Naomi stepped in without hesitation, her shoulders straight, her expression unreadable. As the door clanged shut behind her, she let out a slow breath, her fingers relaxing just slightly around the leather case. "Take a seat," Burke said. It wasn't a request. Naomi didn't move immediately. She scanned the room, taking in every angle, every surface, noting the absence of visible cameras. "Is this how you verify federal credentials now?" she asked, her voice calm but deliberate. Burke smirked. "You show up without ID, without an appointment, carrying sealed documents. Forgive me if I don't trust every well-dressed stranger who thinks they're above procedure." "I never said I was above anything," she replied, finally lowering herself into the cold metal chair. "But you're assuming a lot based on how I look and what I don't say." There was a pause, brief but heavy. Naomi met his gaze directly, not in defiance but in the way a surgeon meets a scalpel, understanding exactly how sharp it is and how much damage it can do. Burke didn't reply. He turned his back instead, reaching for a clipboard on the wall. Alone for a moment, Naomi's eyes drifted to the upper corner of the ceiling. A faint plastic patch covered a spot where a camera might once have been, now sealed shut with a strip of opaque tape. The silence in the room wasn't just physical, it was historical, a silence that echoed with every time she'd been told to be patient, to trust the process, to not make things harder than they had to be. And still she waited. Because Naomi Graves knew that some truths could not be spoken too early, not when the room hadn't earned the right to hear them yet. The hallway outside the holding room seemed to stretch longer than it actually was, humming with a silence that didn't come from lack of activity, but from a kind of practiced indifference, like a place that had seen too many people pass through without ever being noticed. At the far end of that corridor, past the break room and the lockers where junior officers kept their personal gear, sat a small security station built into the wall, like an afterthought, lit by a dim monitor glow and the shifting colors of surveillance feeds on loop. Inside, Calvin Rawls sat quietly, elbows resting on the desk, fingers interlocked, eyes narrowing as one particular feed went dark without warning. For a man in his late 60s, Calvin still carried himself with the upright poise of someone who had once worn a different kind of uniform, a U.S. Army Staff Sergeant badge now tucked away in a box somewhere in his garage, along with medals he hadn't looked at in years. His hair, graying and close-cropped, gave him a kind of deliberate authority, but it wasn't his look that kept people at bay. It was the way he watched. Not like a guard, but like a man who'd seen too many lies dressed up as orders, and who'd learned the difference between following policy and following conscience. When camera 17 labeled Interior Hallway C4 cut to black for more than 10 seconds, Calvin leaned forward. He tapped a key, switched the channel, saw a still image, then a blank feed. No error message, just silence. He sat back, rubbed his jaw slowly, then reached into the side drawer for a yellowed spiral notebook where he jotted down oddities, missing badge swipes, unlocked side doors, anything that felt off but didn't raise alarms with anyone else. Next to today's date, he wrote 3 words, camera C4 down, then added a 4th, Burke. The name had come up in this notebook before. Nothing outright criminal, nothing Calvin could point to and say this is the line, but enough half-formed complaints, enough muttered hallway stories, enough of those brittle smiles from women walking just a little faster when he passed them. Calvin had seen men like Burke before, men who wore authority like armor, who mistook suspicion for instinct, and who treated silence from others as permission to push boundaries further. He toggled through the feeds again and paused on the lobby camera where Naomi Graves had walked through less than 20 minutes earlier. He rewound the footage slowly. There she was, composed, purposeful, carrying a plain leather case. She hadn't argued, hadn't resisted. She'd spoken directly, handed Burke an envelope, and Burke, with that slight shake of the head that Calvin had come to recognize as arrogance disguised as protocol, had led her away without asking a single confirming question. There were rules for handling visiting personnel, especially federal ones. Calvin knew them by heart even if no one else seemed to care. You check credentials. You notify the duty supervisor. You log the entry. You don't take someone off record unless you're trying to make them disappear. He turned in his chair, cracked his knuckles one hand at a time, and considered the risk. If he pushed too hard too fast, they'd freeze him out like they had with others. But if he waited too long, someone could end up buried under paperwork labeled unverified and forgotten for good. From the corner of the room, the radio crackled briefly, nothing urgent, just routine updates from courthouse perimeter units. But underneath it, Calvin could still feel something creeping through the silence. Not fear exactly, but a kind of moral gravity, like the weight that settles over a battlefield just before the first shot is fired. Down the hall in the admin wing on the second floor, Miriam Lister stood at a wide window overlooking the main courtyard, her arms folded, lips pressed together, watching the flagpole sway. She was a federal judge, newly reassigned from the Eastern District, appointed quietly to review a backlog of civil rights violations that had mysteriously stalled over the last 2 years. Nobody here knew that part. They thought she was just visiting, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Naomi had arrived under Lister's direct order, embedded as a covert observer to assess the court's procedural integrity. Lister didn't trust local compliance reports, too polished, too clean, too male, and after reading 24 shredded complaints, she'd chosen Naomi because she needed someone whose silence would be mistaken for submission, someone who could see without being seen. But now, staring out that window and watching the black sedan still idling at the curb, Miriam felt a knot form just behind her ribs. She hadn't expected Burke to be part of the equation. That name wasn't in the file. Or maybe it had been redacted, another oversight disguised as efficiency. A knock at her door startled her. A young clerk peeked in, eyes uncertain. "Ma'am, someone from internal security is requesting." "Well, I'm not sure what. He just asked for 5 minutes." Lister turned slowly, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Send him in," she said, her voice measured. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed her sleeve, and prepared for whatever shape this mistake was beginning to take. Back downstairs, Calvin stepped into the admin suite without a sound, holding his notepad like it contained a confession, even though it only held questions. He didn't ask for small talk. He placed the notebook on her desk and pointed to the time code written beside the entry. 17 minutes ago, camera C4 went dark, he said. At the same time, Officer Burke escorted an unverified woman into a restricted detainment room without logging her presence or contacting a supervisor. Lister scanned the note, then looked up, her eyes sharpened by 1,000 courtroom cross-examinations. "You're saying she's off record?" Calvin nodded. "Off record and unseen. And I don't think it's by accident." For a long second, neither of them spoke. The sounds of office phones, muffled conversations, and distant copier beeps filled the background like static life going on as usual, unaware that something had already begun to shift underneath. Finally, Lister exhaled slowly. "Then we need to move fast, quietly, before this becomes more than an oversight." Calvin looked at her, uncertain. "You think he knows who she is?" Lister didn't blink. "Number. And that's the problem." They both knew what silence like this could hide, and they both understood that by the time the rest of the building caught up, it might already be too late. The sound of the door closing behind her was sharper this time, like metal sealing itself around a truth no one wanted to hear, and for a moment, Naomi didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. She simply sat in that cold, windowless room, with the stale air pressing against her skin, and the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing above, and she waited. Not because she didn't know what was coming, but because she had already lived through too many versions of this moment before, each one packaged a little differently, but always with the same signature isolation, dismissal, and the quiet cruelty of power that needed no justification. Across the room, Officer Burke had shifted into something colder, more methodical. He was no longer just suspicious. Now he was convinced that she was hiding something, that her silence meant defiance, and that defiance needed to be tamed, or, better yet, punished. He didn't sit down. He circled behind her slowly, his boots echoing off the hard floor in deliberate, drawn-out steps, as if savoring each one like a countdown. Naomi's fingers rested on her lap, calm, motionless, but inside her chest, her breath moved with the rhythm of someone preparing for impact, not in fear, but in the precise timing of endurance. "You think I don't see it," he muttered behind her, not asking a question, not expecting an answer. "The way you look at me like you're untouchable. Like walking in here with your fancy case and your quiet mouth gives you power." He stopped just over her shoulder, and she could feel the warmth of his breath shift the air near her cheek, but still she didn't respond. That silence, steady, unbothered, unbroken, did something to him. It pressed against his insecurity like sandpaper on skin, and without warning he moved toward the steel cabinet in the corner, yanking it open with a clatter that rang across the walls like a warning shot. Inside were tools most people never knew existed in buildings like this: riot-grade cuffs, heavy nylon restraints, a gray strap designed for holding detainees upright without leaving obvious marks. Burke pulled it out with a sharp motion, turned back to Naomi, and spoke in a voice so low it might have passed for a whisper if it hadn't been soaked in something far more dangerous. "Let's see how much you really think you are," he said, dragging a tall metal chair to the center of the room, its legs scraping the tile with a screech that made Naomi's jaw tighten. He didn't ask her to stand. He grabbed her by the upper arm, not violently, not enough to bruise, but enough to say "I can," and lifted her with the unceremonious control of someone picking up an object rather than a human being. Naomi rose without resistance, her body moving with the same grace she had carried into courtrooms for decades, even as he forced her to step onto the seat of the chair, even as her wrist was pulled above her head and locked into the ring. Embedded in the ceiling like an afterthought, the restraint clinked shut with a finality that wasn't just mechanical. It was symbolic, like the ghost of a noose, reborn in stainless steel, dressed in the language of procedure, but steeped in something far older. She stood balanced on the chair, her head bowed slightly, not in surrender but in calculation. The air felt heavier now, not just from what was happening but from the weight of every story that had come before her, every nameless woman silenced behind a door like this, every courtroom that had whispered, "You don't belong here," without ever saying the words aloud. Burke took a step back, pulled out his phone and turned on the camera. "This is how we maintain order," he said, more to the lens than to her, his voice shifting into the performative cadence of someone rehearsing for an audience that didn't yet exist. "One more lesson for the ones who think they're above it." Still, Naomi said nothing. Her eyes were open now, watching the far corner of the room, not the camera, not him. The place where a surveillance unit used to be, its casing, removed a hole sealed over with a piece of faded white plastic, was now her point of focus, as if she were looking through it, not past it, as if she knew who might be watching on the other side or who might be listening later when all this was no longer deniable. Then slowly she spoke, not loud, not trembling, but in a voice so steady it carved itself into the room like a chisel into stone. "This is the third time someone's threatened to hang me," she said. "The first time was in 1973. I was 11. The second was during an undercover sting in Alabama. And now, this." Her words weren't a plea, not even an indictment. They were a record placed carefully into the space, like a ledger entry, undeniable and final. Burke paused. Just for a second. The kind of hesitation that creeps in when someone realizes they might be filming something more damning than they intended. But he quickly buried it, scoffing under his breath and muttering, "You people always gotta make it dramatic." Naomi closed her eyes then, not in resignation but in clarity. Behind her lids, she wasn't in this room anymore. She was standing on the courthouse steps where she'd once been sworn in. She was watching her mother adjust her collar before her first mock trial. She was holding the file of a teenage girl whose assault complaint had been dismissed without ever being read. That memory came with a weight sharper than this cuff around her wrist. Somewhere above them, far beyond the reach of Burke's awareness, a light blinked red on a server rack. It was the backup surveillance system triggered not by motion but by phrases calibrated as high-threat alerts. Naomi's words, "threatened to hang me," had activated it. Calvin Rawls, sitting in a dimly lit security room, 2 floors above now, stared wide-eyed at a live feed he hadn't known was active, his hand hovering over the record button like it weighed more than his entire past. Back in the room, Burke leaned against the wall with the smug composure of a man who believed history was written by the loudest voices in the room. "You know what I think," he said, wiping his hands on his uniform pants. "I think your kind needs to remember who's in charge." Naomi's eyes opened again slowly, as if emerging from beneath deep water. She didn't respond, not with words, not with movement. But there was something in the stillness of her shoulders, in the way she remained upright on that chair unshaken, that changed the air itself. It was no longer submission. It was strategy. And for the first time, Burke seemed unsure. Not threatened, not afraid, just unsure. Like something had shifted out from under him, and he couldn't quite say what. Naomi didn't need to say it. Her silence had already spoken, and her body, suspended but not broken, had already begun writing a record far more powerful than anything he could control. Because this wasn't just an act of violence, it was a confession, and the one confessing had no idea he'd already been caught. The chair beneath Naomi's feet felt colder now, not because the room had changed, but because something inside her had shifted, something old, quiet, and precise, like a lock, finally clicking open after years of pressure. She wasn't trembling, not even slightly, though her left hand, still free, had begun to go numb from the way her weight subtly shifted to keep balance. The restraint overhead hadn't tightened further, but it no longer felt like steel. It felt like memory, like every time someone told her to wait her turn, to tone it down, to remember who signed the paychecks and who signed the dismissals. The room was silent except for the mechanical hum of the light above, which flickered once, as if reconsidering its purpose, and the occasional soft scrape of Burke's boots, as he circled her again like a predator, with nowhere else to go. He didn't say much now, not because he had nothing left to add, but because he believed the message had already been delivered, that the silence she maintained was proof he'd succeeded. He stood by the door, arms crossed, phone in his hand like a souvenir, waiting for something, maybe validation, maybe applause, maybe a comment from the chat group where he'd already uploaded a few seconds of what he called disciplinary training. But Naomi wasn't performing for him. She wasn't here to resist or to surrender. She was waiting for the right moment to speak, because some truths didn't land right unless the room was quiet enough to hear them echo. Upstairs, behind a row of monitors in the dim, windowless control room, Calvin Rawls leaned forward slowly, his knuckles tight around the arms of his chair, as he watched the screen he didn't expect to be active. The hidden surveillance system, usually reserved for federal emergencies, had triggered a protocol he'd only read about in the margins of the internal training binder, a system that listened not for gunshots or movement, but for phrases that suggested institutional violence concealed as procedure. Naomi's words. "This is the third time someone's threatened to hang me," had activated the sequence. At first, Calvin thought it was a glitch. The feed came from a camera he was told had been disabled months ago, back when the old witness room was repurposed. But there it was, now grainy, slightly off-angle, but unmistakably live. A black woman, restrained by one wrist, standing atop a chair in the middle of a gray room, with a white man in uniform, leaning against the wall like a coach, watching a sparring match he knew he'd win. Calvin's heart didn't race, but something deeper happened. Instead, his stomach turned cold, his lungs tightened, and he realized that this wasn't just another mistake caught on tape. This was the moment the system always missed, because no one ever believed it would happen inside the building designed to uphold the law. He reached for the console with steady hands, pressed the record button, and labeled the file Live Red Tag Witness Room 2. In the holding room, Naomi's eyes were open again, her breath, even her gaze, fixed directly at the blank space on the ceiling where the old camera casing had once been. She didn't know for sure if anyone was watching, but something in her had begun to rise in awareness, not just of danger but of purpose, of proximity, of timing. She tilted her head slightly, just enough for her voice to land clearly. "I confirm this action is real and is happening," she said, each word shaped with clarity, stripped of all emotion, each syllable weighted like legal code. It wasn't a plea and it wasn't a demand, it was a declaration issued not to Burke but to whatever force had once sworn to listen, if only someone had the courage to speak clearly enough. Burke turned his head, one eyebrow raised, a half-smile flickering. "The hell does that mean?" he asked, but he didn't move closer. Naomi didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the ceiling, not out of hope but out of a quiet conviction that someone somewhere had heard her, and that was enough for now. Calvin heard it all. The system caught every word, time-stamped it, encrypted it, and began backing up the footage to a remote DOJ archive server designed for whistleblower-level events. He didn't speak. He didn't call his supervisor. He just sat still, watched the feed, and let it burn its shape into his memory. Because some things you only witness once in a lifetime, and when they happen, you don't interrupt them. You make sure they're preserved. Back in the room, Burke pushed off the wall and paced again, but this time his footsteps had less certainty, like he was suddenly unsure whether this little theater of control was still going his way. Naomi shifted slightly on the chair, adjusting her balance without breaking composure, her free hand now loose at her side, her fingers curling slowly in and out like they were remembering something soft. Then came the knock. 2 taps on the metal door, not loud, not repeated. Just 2 soft, deliberate knocks, and then silence. Burke froze, turned, walked to the door and pressed his ear against the metal. Nothing. No voices. No footsteps. He opened it quickly, looked out into the empty hallway, saw nothing but the usual flickering lights, and rows of sealed case files stacked along the side. No one in sight. He shut the door harder than necessary, muttering something under his breath about nosy clerks, but Naomi didn't react. She hadn't even looked toward the sound. Her eyes remained on the place above the space where a lens might have once been, and a faint, almost imperceptible shift in her lips. Something between a breath and a smile passed across her face. She knew it was Calvin. She knew he'd knocked twice. Not to intervene, not to rescue, but to let her know he was still there, still watching, still bearing witness, even if he couldn't break protocol. That kind of knock wasn't for show, it was for the soul. And for Naomi, it meant the balance had shifted just enough. Burke stomped back toward her, tension creeping into his voice. "You think someone's coming for you," he spat. "You think that little performance bought you a rescue ticket." Naomi said nothing. Because rescue wasn't the goal. Record was. Truth was. Proof that she had been here, that he had done this, and that the system couldn't pretend not to know. She closed her eyes again, not to rest, but to mark the moment, and let the silence fill the room like smoke, not suffocating, just thick enough to force breath to matter. And in the security room 2 floors above Calvin sat perfectly still, the screen glowing softly before him, knowing without a doubt that whatever happened next, history had already begun recording itself, and this time it wouldn't be erased. The moment the video file left, Officer Burke's phone carried silently through encrypted group chat into a private thread labeled, "For laughs only." Its trajectory changed in ways he couldn't have imagined and wouldn't fully understand until it was too late. The clip was short, just 37 seconds, and in the dim, grainy footage, the scene looked almost staged. A black woman standing on a metal chair, one wrist bound above her posture, straight face unreadable, while Burke's voice narrated, with mock discipline, "This is how we maintain courtroom order." It landed in the chat like a joke, accompanied by a few chuckling emojis, a thumbs up, and one comment, "Bet she won't mouth off again." But among the usual replies came something new, quiet, anonymous, and immediate. A simple forward button hit without comment, without signature, without warning. Within 7 minutes, the clip appeared in a smaller but tightly monitored social justice forum, frequented by watchdogs, former civil rights attorneys, and younger activists raised not on theories but on body cam footage and first-person testimony. It didn't take long. The first public post appeared on a platform built for whistleblowers, time-stamped and stripped of identifying names, but intact enough to reveal the act. A caption ran across the top in bold white font on a black background, "This is not 1963. This was filmed this morning." Beneath it, a single line of text, no charges, no judge, no witnesses, just discipline. It took less than 15 minutes for the clip to cross into Twitter, then TikTok, then a legal archive database monitored by civil rights agencies trained to flag potential abuse in federal facilities. The system was designed to notify slowly, carefully, but this time human outrage outpaced code. Inside the holding room, Naomi still hadn't moved. Her body remained still composed, but inside she could feel the air change, not from temperature, not from movement, but from something she could only describe as a shift in gravity, like the ground beneath her had stopped pretending it wasn't trembling. She couldn't hear the devices buzzing beyond the concrete walls, couldn't see the screens lighting up in bedrooms, coffee shops, and dormitories across the country, but she could feel the pull of something waking up, something watching. Burke, on the other hand, remained unaware, leaning back in the corner of the room like a man who believed the moment had already passed and nothing would come of it. He checked his phone again, smiling at the lack of response from his superiors. No red flags, no urgent calls, no knocks on the door. He thought that meant safety, but what he didn't know was that silence in this case wasn't indifference. It was tension. The kind that builds before a system realizes it's already on fire. Upstairs, Calvin didn't move from his seat. He watched as an internal alert pinged across the bottom of his screen, then disappeared. Another ping, then another. The system's automated response program, long dormant, had begun activating shadow protocols, mirroring footage, offloading copies to cloud redundancy archives housed off-site, and silently alerting the Department of Justice's monitoring division. Calvin leaned back, heart beating slower than it should, because adrenaline wasn't driving him now, conviction was. He reached for his phone, opened a secured channel that bypassed courthouse intranet, and typed one sentence without a name. Level red event confirmed. Internal misconduct verified. Code judicial interference. He didn't press send right away. He looked at the screen again at Naomi, still standing still, composed, and whispered to himself, "Hold a little longer." Then he pressed the button. Outside, the internet had already done its work. The video was now circulating with its own inertia, its own rhythm shared between teenagers in debate clubs and retired judges who hadn't seen anything like it since the 60s. It reached a group of legal scholars reviewing qualified immunity case law. It reached the inbox of a public radio host who dropped everything to prep a midnight segment. It reached the timeline of a mother in Detroit who had once filed a complaint after her daughter was detained without charge and never heard back. She watched the clip in silence, pressed her hand to her mouth and whispered, "They did it again." And still, Naomi remained still. Her eyes had softened now, not in defeat, but in recognition. She had long understood that power rarely showed its face until it felt untouchable. But now she knew it had shown too much. The red light in the corner of the ceiling, a detail Burke had missed entirely, continued its slow blink, a pulse as steady as a heartbeat. She turned her face slightly toward it and whispered once more, "I confirm this action is real, and it is happening." Back in the group chat, the thread began to fracture. Someone posted a question, "Should we delete this?" Someone else replied, "Too late, it's everywhere." Burke finally looked down at his phone, noticed a new message thread had started without him, saw the clip posted publicly with tens of thousands of shares. He clicked the video. His own voice echoed back, "This is how we maintain courtroom order." His stomach twisted. He fumbled with his phone, tried to delete the original clip, but a small icon appeared in the corner, shared externally. "Cannot delete source." He turned his head toward Naomi, but she hadn't looked back. She didn't need to. She'd already felt the tide shift. And for the first time, Burke felt it too. In the hallway, a law intern who'd been stacking boxes near the file room opened his phone, stared at the screen, then looked toward the holding corridor. His name was Marcus, 23. Still learning what law school wouldn't teach. He stared at the image of Naomi, paused the video at the exact moment her eyes met the lens and whispered, "She's the judge, isn't she?" He wasn't the only one. In less than 35 minutes, legal institutions across 3 states had flagged the clip. Civil rights attorneys began preparing emergency motions. Journalists quietly contacted their sources. The DOJ's internal AI system categorized the footage as potential constitutional breach and pushed it into the escalation stream. And still Naomi stood, still balanced, still silent, still unbroken. Because she knew the clip wasn't just video, it was affidavit, testimony, indictment. It was the one thing they couldn't redact or reword or bury beneath procedure. It was truth, raw, recorded, and now, irreversible. The hallway leading from the holding room to courtroom 3B stretched long and narrow like the spine of a building, unsure of its own purpose, its overhead lights flickering softly, as if nervous to expose what they were about to illuminate. Naomi walked with slow, deliberate steps, her wrists free now, but raw with marks that pulsed in time with her heartbeat, and her balance slightly off, not from weakness, but from having stood too long in a position never meant to be endured. Each step she took was silent, yet somehow deafening, as if the tiles beneath her remembered every name erased from the logs, every complaint filed, and quietly dismissed every truth swallowed by the walls. She now passed through like a verdict, returned to its place of origin. The courtroom doors stood slightly ajar when she arrived, as if someone had left it open by mistake, or perhaps as an invitation she hadn't asked for, but now intended to accept. Inside the room was nearly empty. No judge on the bench, no jury in the box, no attorneys lining up arguments with folders and nods. Just a few clerks scattered near the edges, one or two early arrivals in the gallery, flipping through case summaries, unaware that the next 30 minutes would alter everything they thought they knew about procedure, authority, and consequence. Naomi didn't pause at the threshold. She entered the room with the quiet of someone who didn't need permission, who no longer waited for acknowledgement to justify presence. Her heels made soft contact with the old linoleum floor as she moved forward, her gaze passing over each empty seat, each polished rail, each microphone dangling silently above like a sentinel that had nothing left to hear. And then, without ceremony, without announcement, she stepped behind the bench. There was no robe waiting for her there, no gavel polished and laid in anticipation. Only a worn leather chair, high-backed and slightly tilted from years of leaning into the weight of decisions too heavy for one person to carry. She sat, slowly, deliberately, as though reclaiming not just a position but a principle long interrupted. Upstairs, Calvin watched the courtroom feed switch angles as she took her seat. His finger hovered over the notification trigger that would push the internal system alert to the rest of the building, but something told him to wait. Not from hesitation, not from fear, but from instinct, the kind that says, let the moment arrive in full before the rest are told to look. At the far corner of the room, a clerk glanced up, then did a double take. Her eyes widened slightly as she registered Naomi's face, then her position, and then the strange silence that followed. There had been no announcement of a substitute judge, no docket update, no memo slipped under doors at dawn. The clerk looked toward the display screen above the bench. It had been glitching all morning, but now it lit up red with 4 words, scrolling in uppercase block font, UP dating in progress. One of the security officers stepped into the room, then not Burke, but a younger deputy who paused as soon as he saw Naomi. He recognized her not from a suspect list, not from a witness file, but from a training manual, from a grainy photo under the heading, Appointed Federal Oversight Judge District Rotation Pending. His lips parted like he might speak, but no words came. Naomi looked at him calmly, her expression steady, and nodded once. It wasn't a command, not even a cue. It was a recognition. You see me. Now decide how you'll live with that. He lowered his eyes and stepped back. Behind her, the brass nameplate on the judge's bench was missing. In its place, someone had taped a scrap of paper, crooked, and barely clinging to the wood, scrawled in red marker, Temporary Defendant. Naomi reached forward, peeled the paper off, gently folded it in half, and placed it beside her on the desk, not as evidence, but as a record of how far the institution had allowed itself to drift. Then the doors opened again, this time with more noise. Calvin entered not in uniform, not with a badge raised, but with a file folder in one hand and a look on his face that could freeze an argument in its tracks. He didn't walk to the bench. He didn't look at the spectators. He walked straight to the center of the courtroom, opened the folder, and turned toward the gallery. This is a certified appointment notice, issued at 9:03 a.m. this morning by Federal Judge Miriam Lister, he said, voice steady, carrying without effort. It confirms Naomi Graves as the acting federal authority over this district's oversight, proceedings effective immediately. No one moved. No one responded. Not at first. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the indifference of routine. It had become the hesitation of realization, the dawning understanding that something had gone wrong in plain sight, and that the woman now seated behind the bench had not wandered there by mistake, nor been placed there as a token, but had returned to that seat with every right carved into law. From the back someone whispered, "She's the judge." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't repeated, but it landed. Naomi exhaled quietly, her posture unshaken, her hand resting gently on the surface of the desk, as if feeling for the pulse of a system she'd once believed in, and now had returned not to punish but to reawaken. And in that moment, the courtroom began to realign itself, not through violence or orders, but through the quiet, undeniable fact of her presence. Calvin stepped aside, then not retreating but allowing the truth to take center stage. And Naomi, without raising her voice, without touching a gavel or quoting any statute, said only one sentence: "Proceed with the record." There was no thunder, no music, no flags, just that sentence. And with it, the system's silence finally broke. The moment Officer Burke stepped into the courtroom, something inside him recoiled, though he masked it beneath the same smirk he wore when issuing parking citations to elderly black men who questioned his tone, or when dragging out a traffic stop longer than necessary because someone had dared to ask, "Is there a reason?" "I was pulled over." His eyes scanned the room and landed inevitably on Naomi Graves, seated behind the judge's bench. Her posture straight, her eyes forward, her face calm in a way that only deep conviction can make possible. It wasn't defiance in her expression. It was certainty, the kind that makes insecure men shift their weight even when they're the ones wearing the uniform. For a few seconds he said nothing. He just stared, waiting for someone else to object, waiting for the room to correct itself and tell this woman to step down. But no one spoke. Even the court reporter had set down her steno machine with a careful hand, as if what she was about to transcribe needed no filtering, no shorthand, just truth. Calvin stood near the edge of the bench with his arms crossed, watching Burke like a man who had already seen the ending of this story and was simply waiting for the next line to unfold. "What the hell is going on here?" Burke finally snapped, his voice louder than necessary, but with a tremor he couldn't quite suppress. "Who gave her permission to sit up there?" He gestured toward Naomi as though she weren't present, as though she were an object he could refer to in the third person. "She assaulted a federal officer. She resisted detainment. She falsified documents. She's not a judge, she's a threat." No one moved. Naomi blinked slowly, then leaned forward just slightly, her voice cutting through the room like warm steel. "Would you like to enter that as your formal statement for the record, Officer Burke?" Her words didn't rise. They didn't need to. Their weight came not from volume, but from the silence they shattered. Burke stepped back momentarily, caught off guard, then puffed his chest as if trying to re-inflate a power that had just slipped through his fingers. "You're not even supposed to be here," he said now, pacing a short circle. "This whole thing is a setup. There's no judicial order, no notice, no clearance from headquarters." "There is," Calvin replied, his tone, even each word carefully placed like a brick laid against wind. "You just never bothered to check the inbox, marked priority." Burke's eyes flashed toward him, and for a brief moment it looked like he might charge. But something in Calvin's stance, unarmed, relaxed, and completely unshaken, made him hesitate. The kind of hesitation that happens when a man realizes he's the only one in the room who doesn't know what's coming next. Naomi turned toward the court clerk, a young woman whose fingers hovered over the keyboard like she was waiting for permission to breathe. "Read the file," Naomi said. "The one marked Exhibit A." The clerk opened the file folder Calvin had handed her earlier, her eyes widening slightly as she read the first lines. She glanced up, unsure. "Out loud, please," Naomi added. So she began. Exhibit A. Surveillance footage dated this morning, timestamped 8:47 a.m. Location Witness Processing Room 2. Subject Officer Travis Burke. Incident use of unauthorized physical restraint, verbal intimidation, procedural bypass, and unreported detainment of a federal officer without warrant or documented cause. Burke's mouth opened. "This is bullshit." Naomi didn't flinch, and yet there it is. The screen behind the bench flickered on Calvin's cue, and a still frame appeared, black and white, low resolution but unmistakable. Burke, Naomi, the chair, the restraint, her eyes looking straight into the lens and his hand hovering inches from her shoulder like a threat that hadn't yet been acted on. The courtroom held its breath. Burke turned toward the gallery, now suddenly aware of just how many people were watching: clerks, junior attorneys, a law school intern taking notes in the back corner who'd never seen a trial before, but knew instinctively that this wasn't just a hearing. This was something closer to a reckoning. He stepped forward, voice rising. "You can't do this. This whole thing, it's political. She wants to make an example of me. That's what this is about." Naomi looked at him, her eyes as still as the bench she sat on, then said with quiet precision, "The only one making an example, officer, is you." Burke's face flushed, not just with anger now, but something closer to fear, a kind of creeping realization that whatever he thought made him untouchable had already been peeled away. He pointed at her again, voice cracking. "You can't be both judge and victim. That's not how the law works." Her response came like a stone thrown into a still lake. "And yet you thought you could be judge, jury, and executioner." The words landed. They didn't echo, they settled. Heavy, inevitable, just like the silence that followed. Then from the back of the room a door clicked open. A uniformed officer entered, higher rank, heavier insignia. He walked straight to the front, no nods, no announcements, and placed a sealed document on the clerk's desk. "Orders from internal review," he said. "Effective immediately." The clerk read aloud, "Officer Travis Burke is to be relieved of duty badge and weapons surrendered pending federal investigation under Article 76 of the Conduct Accountability Act." Burke's face drained of color. "You people are making a mistake," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore. He turned back to Naomi as if hoping for some gesture of leniency, some acknowledgement of shared profession, shared authority, anything to hold on to. But she didn't give him a speech. She didn't raise her voice. She simply lifted her hand and tapped once on the wood in front of her. Not a gavel strike, just a tap. It sounded like closure. And with that, the courtroom doors opened again, not for him, but for what came next. And this time, it wasn't silence that followed him out. It was the weight of his own actions finally named. The moment the sealed evidence packet was placed on the court clerk's desk, a change in the room's atmosphere became undeniable. Something subtle at first, like the shift in barometric pressure before a storm, that eerie stillness where even whispers feel out of place. Naomi remained seated behind the bench, her expression calm, her hands folded loosely on the desk, but the silence around her wasn't passive anymore. It was poised, alert, like an audience leaning in to listen, not out of curiosity but out of reckoning. The video file labeled Exhibit A had already been reviewed, verified, and authenticated by both internal and federal systems, and now it sat on official record, not as speculation, not as hearsay, but as the truth no one could deny or unsee. Calvin stood just a few feet away, his stance firm but unobtrusive, not inserting himself into the moment, simply anchoring it with presence. He had served in places where silence was a matter of survival, where words could cost lives, and he recognized the weight of a quiet room that had finally turned from complicity to conscience. Naomi gave him a small nod, just enough to say, "We are here now, and it matters," then turned her attention fully to the clerk, who was carefully removing the evidence drive from its sealed bag, her fingers trembling just slightly as she inserted it into the courtroom's central display system. The screen came to life without sound at first, just image cold and clinical, time-stamped and framed from the corner angle of the holding room. There was Naomi bound and standing on the metal chair, and there was Burke, arms crossed, phone, raised mouth, moving with a twisted smirk that even in silence reeked of certainty. The footage was less than 2 minutes long, but time slowed inside the courtroom, as each second unfolded like a confession drawn out in reverse. No denials, no excuses, only facts. The murmurs began near the back of the room, soft exhalations, a hand raised to cover a mouth, the scrape of a chair shifting as someone leaned forward instinctively. And then came the moment when Naomi on that recording looked directly at the camera, her voice clear, even through the grainy playback. "I confirm this action is real and it is happening." It landed like a gavel. The audio wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Her tone wasn't theatrical, wasn't performative. It was measured like the reading of a statute, the way a seasoned witness testifies not to persuade, but to ensure the record is correct. The room fell still again as the clip ended, freezing on the final frame of Burke's face, caught mid-smile, oblivious to the red light blinking in the ceiling above him. Naomi didn't speak right away. She let the silence settle again, not as a pause, but as punctuation. Her gaze moved slowly across the gallery, not in judgment, but in acknowledgement. She saw every face, every stunned expression, every person who now realized they had been sitting in the shadow of a truth they had either ignored or never imagined could arrive in such a measured form. She took a slow breath, then finally spoke, her voice low and even. "What you have just seen is not only an act of misconduct, It is a pattern. The visible tip of a long-buried structure of silence, protection, and fear. Her words didn't rise in pitch, didn't lean into emotion, but their clarity was sharper than any accusation. It is not the rope that matters most. It is the fact that it was done without hesitation, without challenge, and until this moment without consequence. From the prosecution table, a junior attorney, a man no older than 30, clean-shaven, fresh suit, raised his hand halfway, then lowered it again, as if he wanted to speak, but didn't yet know how. Naomi noticed, waited, then gently nodded. "Go ahead," she said. He stood slowly. "Your Honor," he began, the words catching in his throat, "does this change the nature of the charges currently pending?" Or he paused, searching for footing. "Or does this open an entirely new case?" Naomi held his gaze. "Both," she said simply. She then reached for the document beside her, an official motion drafted in advance, pre-approved by the Federal Oversight Committee, in anticipation of a worst-case scenario. She slid it forward. "Effective immediately, this courtroom will enter a transitional phase under the authority of the Department of Justice's Emergency Integrity Protocol. All cases involving Officer Burke are hereby suspended. A judicial inquiry is to begin within 72 hours to investigate prior complaints, closed reports, and patterns of suppression connected to this officer's conduct." She paused briefly. "This includes an audit of dismissed filings from the last 10 years. The clerk swallowed hard and began transcribing her keys, clacking in rhythm with the kind of urgency usually reserved for verdicts. The room had gone from passive observation to procedural motion in the space of one statement, and even those who had spent decades in the legal system now understood they were witnessing not a correction but a confrontation with the very framework of assumed justice. Burke, now seated off to the side in civilian clothes, after being stripped of badge and firearm, shifted uncomfortably. His face no longer wore anger, just confusion. A man used to being feared now simply watched. And for the first time he seemed to register that the power he once believed lived in his belt or his voice had never really belonged to him. It had been borrowed, unchecked, and now finally returned. Naomi looked out at the courtroom one more time before closing her file. "The law does not bend for fear, and it will no longer bend for familiarity," she said. "What happened in that room was not a failure of training. It was a reflection of tolerated culture. That ends now. No one applauded, no one moved, because the truth once named doesn't need a reaction, it only needs to stand." And in that moment it stood with Naomi, steady, undeniable, documented. For a long moment after Judge Naomi Graves finished speaking, the courtroom remained frozen in a kind of collective stillness, not the tense, fearful kind that precedes a verdict, but the quiet that arrives when people begin to realize they are standing in the middle of history, as it unfolds in real time. The screen behind the bench still displayed the final frame of the footage, the image of Burke's face caught mid-smirk, frozen forever, as the embodiment of impunity meeting its end. No one reached for their phones. No one whispered to a neighbor. Even the sound of the air conditioner seemed to pause, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. And then slowly it began, first with a sound so small it was almost missed the creak of an old wooden pew as someone rose to their feet. She was elderly, well into her 70s, wearing a faded lilac dress with lace trim and a pocketbook clutched tightly against her chest like a shield she'd carried for decades. Her name was Mrs. Clara Whitmore, a lifelong resident of the district and widow of a postal worker who once filed a complaint after being stopped and searched without cause, twice in 1 week by Officer Burke. That complaint had vanished, she said, just like her faith in the system. "I wrote letters," she said quietly, voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. "I mailed them certified. I followed the rules. I believed they'd do something." She paused, looked at Naomi, and then out at the gallery. "But no one ever called me back." A ripple moved through the room, not applause, not outrage, just breath. A collective exhale from people who hadn't realized how long they'd been holding something inside. Another person stood, this time a younger man with a worn security badge clipped to his belt and a notebook tucked under his arm. His name was Javier Luna, courthouse maintenance staff. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I saw him once," he said, nodding toward Burke, now seated and silent with his gaze lowered. "He grabbed a teenage boy by the collar in the stairwell. said he fit a description. There was no report filed that day. His voice was calm, almost apologetic, as if afraid to sound accusatory. I thought maybe I should have said something. I didn't. Naomi met his eyes gently and said nothing because she knew the look he carried. The weight of inaction is often heavier than the weight of harm. And now that burden was surfacing not to shame, but to cleanse, to allow those silences to be broken without retaliation. From the third row, a public defender named Tamika Lawson stood next. She had been waiting for years, perhaps unconsciously, for a moment like this to exist. Her voice was strong but not rehearsed. I've represented at least 6 clients who said Officer Burke planted evidence, she said plainly. Each time I filed a motion, the charges were dismissed quietly, without explanation, without apology, without ever reaching a judge. I asked questions. I never got answers. A younger woman in the gallery sitting beside her mother raised her hand halfway, then stood as if pulled by something deeper than courage. My brother was arrested in front of our house, she said, voice quivering. He was 16. All he did was ask why they were shouting. They took him in. He came back different, quieter, angrier. I didn't even know that officer's name until I saw the footage today. One by one, the voices filled the room, not in protest, but in testimony layered like brushstrokes over a truth too long, buried under bureaucracy and denial. They came from legal aides, janitors, teachers, even a former prosecutor who admitted that certain cases were discouraged from proceeding because they involved officers with unusually high clearance ratings. No one yelled. No one pointed fingers. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was something deeper. A woman in the back row, her gray hair tied into a bun, stood with tears brimming in her eyes. I was the one who typed the initial complaint, she said, about what he did to the girl in the stairwell. I typed it, I passed it to my supervisor. And the next day it was gone. Her hands gripped the wooden bench in front of her like she needed it to stay upright. And I said nothing. Naomi listened to each voice without interrupting her posture, never shifting her expression, never hardening, because she understood that what she was witnessing wasn't an unraveling, it was an unsealing, a long overdue opening of a room. No one wanted to enter, but everyone had been trapped inside. When the last voice fell silent, when the final confession landed gently into the air like a feather descending onto marble, Naomi took a deep breath and closed the folder in front of her. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply let the silence settle again, heavier now, but cleaner like the air after a summer storm when the heat has broken and the soil begins to breathe again. She looked around the room, then spoke with the same quiet clarity she had used from the beginning. Let the record reflect, she said, that what happened here today was not a hearing, it was a remembering. And in that remembering, the courtroom, once a place where truth had been locked behind titles and procedures, had become, at least for a moment, what it was always meant to be. A place where silence finally gave way to voice and justice began to grow not from punishment but from truth that had found the courage to speak. The next morning, the courtroom doors opened not to a docket of scheduled hearings or routine motions, but to something entirely different, something unspoken, but deeply felt, as if the building itself understood that what was about to take place had little to do with punishment and everything to do with bearing witness. The gallery filled slowly, not with lawyers checking their watches or defendants fidgeting with cuffs, but with people who had seen the footage, heard the stories, or simply felt that if they didn't show up now, they'd be missing a moment they would regret for the rest of their lives. There were no cameras, no press briefings. Just ordinary citizens, courthouse staff, a few veterans in clean jackets, and one girl in a school uniform clutching a spiral notebook like it, held the truth she hadn't yet found the words for. Judge Naomi Graves entered the room, not with ceremony, but with steady purpose, her black robe folding neatly around her frame, like armor that needed no shine to be respected. She stepped to the bench, placed her palm flat on the wood, not out of habit, but as an act of grounding, and sat with the quiet dignity of someone who no longer carried the need to prove herself. She didn't look at the audience first. She looked straight ahead at the center of the courtroom, where an empty table had been placed flanked by 2 microphones and a stack of files, each one representing a complaint previously dismissed, closed without explanation, or never logged. At all. This hearing, she began, her voice level, is not adversarial. It is not a trial. It is a restoration." Her eyes met the clerk's, and she gave a slight nod, which prompted the clerk to announce the session as a public inquiry into patterns of silenced misconduct within the district's justice system spanning a 10-year window. The first speaker was a retired police officer named Gerald Haskins, who stood not in defense of his badge but in quiet mourning of what had been done in its name. His hands shook as he held the document, naming the 3 occasions he had witnessed Burke falsify field reports, always with that same tone of casual contempt, always toward those whose last names didn't match the ones on street signs in the wealthier part of town. "I told a supervisor once," Gerald said, his voice thick. "They told me, he gets results, let it go. So I let it go, and I never forgave myself." As he returned to his seat, Naomi didn't respond with judgment or comfort. She simply looked down, made a note in the margin of a manila folder, and moved forward. One by one voices rose, some trembling, some angry, some so calm they made the truth even harder to bear. Each speaker wasn't just offering testimony. They were reclaiming history, rewriting it with the ink of lived experience rather than redacted reports. A former court clerk read from a memo she'd found years ago in a trash bin, one instructing a junior staffer to decline all civilian filings referencing Officer Burke unless accompanied by third-party verification. A legal aid attorney provided data on bail disparities connected to Burke's arrests, each figure a quiet indictment carved in spreadsheets. A mother who had never set foot in a courtroom before stood in borrowed heels and spoke with the raw clarity of someone whose child had been handcuffed at 12. "He never said a word about it," she whispered. "Until last week when he saw the footage and asked, 'Is this what happens to people like me?'" The gallery remained silent throughout, not out of discomfort but out of reverence, as if any interruption would undo the fragile bravery that filled the air. Naomi listened to every voice, made space for every sentence, and marked each story not with comment but with quiet validation. Her presence didn't dominate the room, it shaped. It gave it permission to expand beyond legal formality into something closer to healing. At one point, someone asked hesitantly if Burke would be allowed to speak. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the table where the complaints sat, then back up at the gallery. "This is not a trial," she repeated, "and he is not on trial here. But what he chose to do and what others chose to ignore brought us to this moment. And this moment is for those who were never offered one." Near the end of the session, a teenage boy rose from the far back row. His voice cracked once, but his eyes didn't waver. "My cousin was arrested by Burke," he said. "She was a straight-A student. They said she fit a description." He paused, breathing through the weight of memory. "She changed after that, quiet, stopped laughing. She doesn't trust anyone in uniform now, not even school security." Then, after a pause that felt like a lifetime, he added, "But I came here today because I want to trust again." Naomi looked at him the way you look at someone who has just handed you something fragile. "Thank you," she said. "Let the record reflect your voice." And with that, the final file was closed, not as an ending but as the beginning of a process long overdue. Naomi rose slowly from the bench, her body heavier with everything she had absorbed but her eyes clearer than they had been in years. She didn't strike the gavel. She didn't make a grand statement. She simply said, "This hearing is adjourned, but the work is not." And in that simple exit, the courtroom didn't erupt or dissolve. It exhaled, like a wound no longer hidden, like a city finally ready to heal from within. By the time the inquiry had concluded, and the last testimony was entered into the official record, the sky outside the courthouse had shifted into that dusky golden haze that comes just before evening settles in, when sunlight starts to stretch shadows long across pavement, and the world feels momentarily suspended between reflection and release. Inside, the room remained half full, though the energy had changed. It no longer buzzed with the weight of what needed to be said, but with the solemn reverence of what had finally been heard. Naomi Graves sat alone at the bench for a long moment after everyone else had filed out her fingers, gently tracing the edge of a manila folder, not reading its contents but feeling its texture, as if each crease held a name she could never afford to forget. She hadn't spoken much during the final hour of testimony. There had been no need. The voices had spoken for themselves, raw, unfiltered, and so painfully human that even the marble walls of the courtroom seemed to absorb their echoes. What struck her most wasn't the confessions or the data points or even the public acknowledgement of Burke's misconduct. It was the realization that people had begun to speak not because they thought it would change the system, but because they finally believed someone in the room was listening. Outside the doors, a low murmur of conversation lingered, not loud or disruptive, just threads of processing people, comparing notes, making promises to follow up, hugging those they had only moments ago seen cry. Naomi rose from her seat slowly, her knees stiff from hours of stillness but her posture never faltering. She stepped down from the bench, not as an official, not as a judge, but as a woman walking through the remains of something she had helped dismantle. Each step echoed faintly, but it wasn't the echo of authority, it was the rhythm of resolve. In the hallway, Calvin waited silently beside a bench beneath the large courtroom seal, his arms folded, eyes distant. When Naomi approached, he stood without a word, offering her a quiet nod that spoke volumes. They didn't need to recount what had happened inside. They had lived it. Calvin reached into his jacket and handed her a sealed envelope stamped with the insignia of the Department of Justice. "Final reviews in," he said simply. "Full federal referral. Formal charges pending. Internal affairs is moving fast." Naomi held the envelope for a moment before slipping it into her case, already knowing what it contained, but understanding that sometimes the physical act of holding proof still mattered. She looked at him and asked softly, "You?" Staying on Calvin gave a faint smile, one corner of his mouth rising just slightly. "For now," he said, "but not forever." They both knew that men like him rarely stayed long after justice had finally found its footing. They drifted to other battles, quieter ones, often unrecognized, but no less necessary. She placed her hand gently on his arm, held it there for a beat, then nodded in thanks. And just like that, they parted. Outside the courthouse, the plaza had thinned, but a few reporters lingered at a respectful distance, unsure whether to approach. Naomi didn't look at them. Instead, she turned toward the far side of the square, where a low marble wall ran parallel to the sidewalk, and a bronze dedication plaque glinted faintly in the fading sun. Seated on that wall was a boy no older than 13, wearing jeans 2 sizes too big, and a backpack that looked heavier than it needed to be. His name was Deshaun, and he had spoken the day before just a few short sentences about his mother and how she had once been detained for asking why the police had blocked her driveway. He hadn't said much. He didn't need to. As Naomi approached, he looked up and gave a nod. "I saw you on my cousin's phone," he said, "when you were standing on the chair." She smiled, gently surprised by how matter-of-fact his tone was. "I wasn't supposed to be seen," she replied. "But I'm glad I was." He kicked his foot against the wall absently, eyes still on the street. "They took everything from her, you know. My mom. They made her feel like she didn't matter." Naomi sat beside him, not too close, letting the silence settle comfortably between them. "They tried," she said, "but she raised someone who showed up to speak." He looked at her then finally. And in his eyes was something more complex than admiration, it was understanding. "Are you still gonna be the judge?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. I've done what I came to do." He paused, thoughtful. "So what now?" Naomi turned her gaze to the courthouse steps behind them, then to the people still quietly gathered beyond the gates. "Now," she said, "we make sure the next generation doesn't have to prove what we already know." Later that evening, Naomi returned to her office for the last time, the light dim, the windows glowing amber with the last breath of day. She sat at her desk, pulled out one final file, and signed the resignation letter she had written weeks earlier but waited to submit. Not because she had doubts, but because she knew endings deserved their proper time. She placed the letter into the inbox tray, then opened a second folder marked Fellowship Proposal Legal Pathways Initiative, a program designed to identify and mentor young voices from marginalized communities and give them the tools to become public defenders, civil rights, attorneys, judges, and more than that, advocates unshaped by cynicism. She smiled to herself as she scanned the first page. It was already funded, already approved, already waiting, and the first name on the candidate list, Deshaun. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and let the stillness surround her, not empty but earned. Because in the end, Naomi Graves didn't need to wear the robe forever. She only needed to make sure the next person didn't need permission to put it on. The courtroom that had once crackled with tension and trembled beneath the weight of withheld stories now sat empty, bathed in a quiet afternoon light that filtered in through high windows and softened every corner. Dust moved gently in the sunbeams like tiny particles of memory that hadn't yet decided whether to settle or keep drifting. The bench where Judge Naomi Graves had sat for the last time stood untouched. Her nameplate removed her files, cleared her presence, lingering, not in objects, but in the stillness itself, an absence that somehow felt more powerful than presence had ever been. No one spoke about her departure in formal terms. There were no ceremonies, no speeches, no framed plaques of gratitude. But something had shifted subtly, completely, and those who passed through that space now did so with a different rhythm, with eyes more aware of the silence, ears more attuned to the voices that had finally been heard within those walls. On the bench where she had once rested her hand before speaking, someone had placed a single folded note, unsigned with handwriting, barely legible. "Don't let them cover this up. Thank you for not flinching." The chair she once occupied was left where it had always been, but a thin velvet rope now framed its edges, not to restrict access, but to mark meaning. A small brass plaque had been added to the front panel flush with the wood, its lettering simple and unadorned. "This seat is reserved for those who never needed a robe to deliver justice." Down the hall, in a quiet room newly repurposed from storage, the early framework of something different was beginning to take shape. It wasn't a courtroom and it wasn't an office. It was a space for listening, bare walls, lined with corkboards and photographs, transcripts from the inquiry printed and pinned like pages from a living archive. A dozen folding chairs had been arranged in a loose circle, the kind that suggests dialogue, not instruction. At the center of the circle sat a single empty seat, deliberately left untouched, as a reminder that no room is complete until every voice is accounted for. This was the beginning of the Legal Pathways Initiative, a fellowship seeded from Naomi's final act on the bench, her resignation, not as retreat but as redirection. The program had already received its first wave of applications. Many handwritten, some typed, a few scribbled on notebook paper torn from the back of school binders. One came from a girl named Myra, 15 years old, who wrote, "I never thought I'd belong in a place like that, but when I saw her sit in that chair, I knew I could." Each week, new faces arrived, young people from neighborhoods overlooked by census counts and ignored by school board zoning, carrying stories shaped by systemic barriers, but told with voices that refused to stay quiet. They didn't come to be taught how to fit into the system. They came to learn how to understand it, challenge it, and eventually change it. And every week someone would ask the same question. "Is she coming back?" The answer was always the same, delivered gently, never apologetically. "She's not here, but what she started is." Naomi Graves herself never returned to the courthouse. Not physically, not publicly. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't appear on panels. She declined every award offered in her name, every request to headline speaking engagements. Instead, she traveled quietly, often alone, moving between small towns and local bar associations, visiting community centers where free legal aid was just a dream scribbled on a donation envelope. She never stayed long, but she always left something behind: a contact, a copy of a civil rights statute, annotated by hand, a folder labeled "Resources for the next one in line." Sometimes she'd stand outside courthouses unnoticed, listening. Just listening. Not to cases, but to people, custodians, chatting in break rooms, cafeteria workers on lunch breaks, clerks, sharing quiet frustrations about systems they couldn't name but felt every day. She wasn't interested in headlines. She was interested in pressure points, the places where silence still ruled, and where someone, somewhere, was waiting for a sign that resistance was possible. And every so often she would hear her name spoken, not loudly, not ceremoniously, but in quiet, reverent tones. She's the one who stopped it. She's the reason they reopened the file. That was the chair they left for her. Naomi never interrupted. She would just smile sometimes, nod and walk away before they could ask her to confirm what they already knew. Back at the original courthouse, the chair remained. People didn't sit in it. They didn't dare. But they stood before it, sometimes lawyers and law students and janitors and old women with long memories, Some would run their fingers along the plaque. Some would leave folded notes, pressed flowers, newspaper clippings. One child, no more than 10, left behind a hand-drawn picture of a black woman with silver-streaked hair and a gavel in one hand standing taller than the building behind her. In the top corner in crayon she had written, "She told the truth and didn't take it back." And so the chair became not a symbol of power, but a symbol of purpose. A reminder that justice isn't about robes or gavels or sealed chambers. It's about the willingness to stand when standing is hardest to speak, when silence is safest to act, when delay would be easier. In the end, Naomi Graves left behind no title, no legacy written in marble, no doctrine named after her. What she left was more enduring a space where silence had been broken, where truth had been allowed to breathe, and where a single empty chair could remind 1,000 people that the law means nothing until it sees everyone. And for those who enter that courtroom now, the message is clear. That chair isn't waiting to be filled. It's waiting to be honored. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one officer or one act of cruelty. It was about an entire system built on silence and the courage it takes to finally break it. Judge Naomi Graves didn't raise her voice, but she raised something far more powerful, the standard. Her quiet strength reminded us that justice isn't found in robes or titles, it's found in truth, in presence, and in the willingness to listen to those who've been ignored for far too long. This story teaches us that speaking up, even when your voice shakes, can open doors that have been locked for generations. That silence is never neutral. And that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stay standing until the system is forced to sit and listen. To those watching, especially our elders who've lived through injustice and know its long shadow, this story is yours too. You've seen what it takes to hold your ground when the world turns away. And now more than ever, your wisdom matters. Your voice matters. Your memory matters. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something you've seen, felt, or survived, don't let it stop here. Please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak truth with heart and purpose. Because justice doesn't live in headlines, it lives in us, and together we keep it alive.